Hey everybody, how's everyone doing? I hope you're holding up all right there at home, and I hope everybody's enjoyed a good holiday weekend. Um, and we're just going to continue really quick. So this week would have normally have been spring break. Obviously, with everything that's going on, we're kind of changing some things up. And the what we've been asked to do is just to provide some work. My plan is just to provide some light work for everybody. So you'll have stuff today, but that's going to be it. I won't post anything on Wednesday like we typically would. What I'm going to ask you to do is use that to get caught up. So there was some information that went out to your emails over the weekend. I think on Saturday I sent some stuff out. And essentially, the district right now is moving forward with grades, but not numerical grades. So everybody's going to get either a pass or an incomplete. Read through that email that I sent out for details. I don't want to cover the whole thing here because it's already in writing. But the idea is pretty much no actual due dates. So the due dates I'm posting are all just kind of to keep you on pace so that you're not getting too far behind. You'll have an opportunity to make up any work that you need to. You can go back and make up work from the third quarter. Anything you still owe, you can submit that, turn it in, and get partial credit for that. So if you want to improve your grades, that's probably the best way that you can do it. We're going to wrap up Southeast Asia here today. And then we'll start on Japan next Monday. Essentially, what we've been asked to do is just condense the curriculum. So we're kind of compressing everything. So we're taking everything that we normally would have done over the course of the rest of the semester and really just kind of teaching the most important parts. So from this point forward, everything's going to be like with Japan, I'm really going to scale down what we're talking about and what we're covering. And then after that, it's our European Studies unit. So it'll be early European history. And we'll just go through that really quick and just nail the fine points that you're going to really kind of need for 10th grade in the global Regents exam. So let's get on with what we have to do today. So we're going to talk pretty much about Southeast Asia from the end of World War II right up until probably late 2000s or early 2000s. The key thing here is that it's going to basically follow the same model that we talked about in other places like Africa. So when we talked about Africa, we talked about World War II being a major turning point in Africa when it came to those colonies under European rule fighting for independence throughout the 1940s, 50s, 60s, some of them even into the 70s and 80s. But really, most of it's going to take place around the 1950s and 60s. And we're going to see the same trend here in Southeast Asia, where we're going to have many nations that are going to seek independence from their European colonial powers. They're all going to be, there's going to be a variety of independence movements. And we're not only going to focus on a couple of the big major ones, but it follows that same pattern of post-World War II, UN declarations of freedom and declarations of self-determination. And so we're going to see nations throughout Southeast Asia that were colonies looking to have their own self-determination and set up their own countries. So following the end of World War II, what we're going to see is this rise in communism. And so this whole Cold War concept, this whole Cold War setup is going to situate most of the planet when it comes to politics between the United States and the Soviet Union, and this kind of a fight between democracy and capitalism versus, you could call it communism, although it doesn't, it's more of a theoretical type of a thing, but these kind of totalitarian or authoritarian states that had a lot more rule and tried to spread wealth a little bit more between people. And so what we end up with, particularly in Southeast Asia, is a concern about something called the domino theory. So the idea that if you let one nation fall, it's going to hit that next nation, and they're all going to fall like dominoes. And so once one nation turns communist, the rest in a region are all going to turn communist as well. And so that's the big idea for the United States, is trying to prevent that domino theory, trying to prevent countries from becoming communist nations and maintaining them or turning these new independent nations into democratic societies with capitalist free market economies. So in Vietnam, which is the big one we're going to kind of focus on, we're really going to focus on this one because the United States gets directly involved. So prior to World War II, Vietnam was a French colony. It had been a French colony for over 100 years and had a large French influence there. But with World War II and France being invaded by Nazi Germany, we're going to see withdrawal of troops. And those troops are going to be French troops that are going to go back and try to fight against the Nazis in France. And once they are forced to leave the country, to try to win back their country. But the idea is that they vacated Vietnam during that time period. After World War II, the Vietnamese are going to push for their own independence through nationalism. This gentleman right here, the picture is of Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the independence movement, who was seeking to have a free and independent Vietnam. And he's going to push for this after the end of World War II. And basically what happens is the French come back to their colony and they wish to reestablish their control over the colony. But after several years of being gone and Vietnam being in sort of a pseudo-independent state, that's not really going to be in their best interest. So we're going to have Ho Chi Minh and a group of others who seek help from communist nations like the Chinese and the Russians in an attempt to kind of gain their independence from France. So the first Indochina War is going to be a war between this war of independence between Vietnam and France. During this time period, when France tries to come back and regain control of their colony, the Vietnamese are going to fight back. So the main group here is going to be the Viet Minh, and they're going to be underground guerrilla fighters who are going to fight against the French and try to maintain their independence. As I said before, the Soviet Union and China are going to get involved in supporting Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese nationalists. The United States is going to get involved in supporting the French. And again, this is all to stem the tide of the concern of what was called the domino theory. Eventually, the French are going to withdraw their forces. They basically give up. They've faced a series of devastating battles with a high loss of life and just decided this wasn't worth it anymore. The treaty that resolved that situation is called the Geneva Accords. And in 1954, France withdrew from Vietnam and Cambodia, their major colonies in Southeast Asia. What it did is it created two states within Vietnam. North Vietnam was to be led by Ho Chi Minh, and it would be a communist nation with a capital in the city of Hanoi. And they go through a series of setting up their own basically independent governmental and economic system. In the South, you have a separate nation, South Vietnam, being led by Ngo Dinh Diem, and he's going to be supported by the Americans. The big problem with Ngo is that he is very corrupt. And so we've aligned ourselves with a corrupt leader in an attempt to prevent the spread of communism. But the problem with that, obviously, is we're aligned with a corrupt leader. And so this is not a great situation for the United States. But in our overall attempt to try to stem communism, we had to make a choice, or we chose to make a choice. Couple of other things. So we have another group called the Viet Cong. So we have the Viet Minh, who were the guerrilla fighters against the French. They will continue to exist in North Vietnam. The Viet Cong are going to be the pro-communist guerrillas in South Vietnam. So these are going to be guerrilla fighters kind of hidden amongst the population. or hidden in the jungles who are going to fight against the South Vietnamese army and the Americans throughout the Vietnam War. The United States really gets drawn into this conflict by something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which followed an attack on an American ship in the Gulf of Tonkin. There's a lot of debate about how that took place and whether or not that took place, but regardless, it was the event that got the United States really involved in South Vietnam. Once our ship was attacked, the President Johnson at the time, Lyndon Johnson, escalated the number of troops in Vietnam. Prior to that, we had advisory troops. We had Marines there to give advice to the South Vietnamese and to help train the South Vietnamese. But with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, we start sending American troops to Vietnam to help fight in this endeavor. So you can see here in 1965, the number of American troops was 500,000. So we basically went from a few hundred to 500,000 very rapidly. By 1968, we have a situation around a holiday called Tet. And typically throughout this time period during Tet, which I believe was a Lunar New Year celebration, you would typically have a ceasefire. So we had this ceasefire with the Vietnamese, but they essentially pulled a surprise attack and attacked a bunch of American and South Vietnamese military establishments throughout the South. And this becomes a major turning point. And the reason why it becomes a major turning point is for the first time, we have war being broadcast on televisions during the nightly news and during like news magazine shows like 60 Minutes, where you have these reporters who are in the field with cameras reporting about what's happening. And you have young American men coming back in body bags. They're dying in Vietnam. A large number of them are dying in Vietnam, and people start to question the value of American lives being lost in a foreign nation. Tet really highlighted that because of the devastation and the major losses that we had during that time period. And so then that starts kind of its own domino effect in the United States of leading toward a rise, a greater rise in the anti-war establishment. In 1968, Richard Nixon is elected president. In 1969, he starts a program called the Vietnamization Program. Essentially what that is, just a drawdown of troops, slowly withdrawing American troops out of Vietnam while increasing the role of the South Vietnamese to independently and freely govern their own nation. Eventually, the United States is going to withdraw from Vietnam in 1976. So it's essentially a 10-year war a hot war that we're really involved in. Following the United States withdrawal from South Vietnam, the North Vietnamese move into South Vietnam and essentially win the war and unite North Vietnam and South Vietnam as one communist country. The next major hotspot during this time period is Cambodia, which is shared a border with Vietnam. And in Cambodia, we have a very different situation. It was also a French colony. When the French pull out of Vietnam, they also pull out of Cambodia, as we just talked about. But from 1975 to 1979, we have a group called the Khmer Rouge that are basically the Communist Party in Cambodia. And they're led by a man by the name of Pol Pot. And Pol Pot really has an idea of returning Cambodia to an agrarian society. And part of this is going to mean taking part in a series of acts that are genocidal in nature, of killing off people because of who they are or what they do, what positions they have in society. So there was an identifying process where they would take educated people from universities and businessmen and upper middle class and middle class individuals who they saw as a threat to this agrarian farm-like sort of an ideal society, a utopian agrarian society. And they go through a process of executing people. And this was a time where millions of people were feared to, at least 1 million people were feared to have been executed. The way in which they went about this was really kind of striking in the fact that Pol Pot had, as you can see on the pictures here, that is Pol Pot here at the top. But what they did is they took pictures of everybody that they executed. They put them they rounded up the people from the cities. They emptied out every city in Cambodia, moved people out into the countryside, where they were all going to live on these farms that were going to provide for everybody and was going to provide a better life for everybody. And with the people who they felt were either a detriment to that or were going to be resistant to that, they put them into re-education camps. And if they didn't readily feel like they were going to become good Cambodian communists or good Khmer Rouge members, they were executed. And so they took their pictures, they buried them in mass pits that has since they've been referred to as the killing fields. And as I said, up to 1 million people died during this genocidal event in Cambodia. In a neighboring country, Myanmar, or also called Burma, we have an independence movement led by the father of this woman. Her name is Aung San Suu Kyi, and her father leads an independence movement. She establishes or tries to establish a democratic society, but she ends up being imprisoned as an opposition leader to the ongoing groups that are in power there. So it's basically a military rule in Myanmar. Aung San Suu Kyi was essentially seen as being a female Gandhi in this area. She kind of bestowed peaceful means for trying to protest, nonviolent protest. She was jailed several times, placed under house arrest several times. Today, she is independent and a member of the parliament in Myanmar. But she's had her own criticisms in recent times for having a series of, or advocating for a series of policies against the, I believe it's the Muslim groups, the Rohingya in Myanmar. And so she had won the Nobel Peace Prize at one point. Today, she's kind of seen as being a little bit of an authoritarian ruler herself. So throughout Southeast Asia, what we're going to see as far as the economic landscape, we're going to see a real major growth, particularly from the 1980s on. During this time period, we're going to see some of these countries really develop, particularly Vietnam, became kind of a quasi-communist capitalist society where they did allow a lot of free enterprise. They did start to develop a lot of manufacturing base, and a lot of our products here in the United States are today made in Vietnam. Some other countries like Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, they've continued to be major economic powers throughout that region. We look at, as I was just saying, if we look at Vietnam today, they've made a lot of capitalist reforms. It's one of the fastest growing economic countries in that region. Similar to China, they kind of maintain a communist or an authoritarian state, an authoritarian government, but economically there are a lot more freedoms. And that's it. So this wraps up the notes for Southeast Asia. As I said, next week we're going to start Japan. This is the only work I'm posting for this week, so try to get caught up with whatever free time you have during the rest of the week. I may or may not do a Google Meet on Wednesday. We'll see how that goes. But I hope everybody's staying healthy. I hope everybody's having an opportunity to reconnect with family and enjoy some of the time that you're having here at home. I do miss you guys. I do miss being at school. I'm going a little stir crazy here myself, but I think we're all going to get through this pretty easily and pretty well, and hopefully we'll get back to school here, if not this year. And I have no idea what's going to happen, but if not this year, then definitely in the fall. So wrap up the rest of this work, finish up your notes, and let me know if you have any questions. Just send me an email anytime. I'm here. All right, take care.